I'm David Costello. I'm the Secretary of AIIA Queensland. And tonight we are very, very fortunate to have Professor Alex Bellamy from UQ. He is going to be talking about the quest for a peace in a world in flames. Alex, it's great to have you back. You've been a very popular presenter for us. And we're pretty eager to hear what you've got to say, because your theme, let's face it, it's very topical. In your summary, you said from Syria to Sudan, from Myanmar to Venezuela, societies are being ripped apart by wars that our global institutions and laws seem incapable of dealing with. To that, we can add Afghanistan, and there is the growing tension between China and the West as well, and the possible threat of conflict over Taiwan. So, Alex, I don't know if you can do it, but we're looking for some hopeful signs amidst this very gloomy outlook. As I've said before, Alex is a very popular and sought after speaker, spoken to some of the other states as well. He is the Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies and the Director of the Asia Pacific Centre for Responsibility to Protect at the University of Queensland. He's the author of a forthcoming book published by Columbia University Press in the spring of 2022 on the betrayal of Syria, war, atrocity, and the failure of international diplomacy. And his most recent book is World Peace and How We Can Achieve It, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Now, we're going to listen to Alex speak for about 40 minutes, and then there will be Q&A. So there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you could put your questions in there, we'll get them to Alex. Well, you've come here tonight to listen to Alex Bellamy, and we've got plenty of registrations for tonight. So it's over to you, Alex.
Great, thanks very much, David, and good evening, everyone. And it's a great pleasure to be with you all tonight. And thanks very much for giving your time to come and hear me wittering on in your busy day. So really appreciate it. Now, I was just talking to David about my Zoom skills, and I was saying that although I'm better than I used to be with Zoom, and given that I didn't used to know what Zoom was, that's not a very high standard. I'm still a bit clunky. So I'm going to switch now to a PowerPoint presentation. So you've got something prettier than me to look at for the next half an hour or so, but bear with me as I do, and apologies in advance if this isn't the smoothest transition that you've ever seen. So hopefully that's all right. And you can see sort of a blurry cover of the front page of my 2019 book, World Peace, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight. And as you might have kind of gathered from David's generous opening words, my more recent work has been on something less optimistic than World Peace. So it's been on the war in Syria. So if this is the optimism of 2019, my more recent work is maybe more reflective of the pessimism of 2021. But in many ways, this World Peace book is something that grew out of 2 decades of research, writing, and practice in relation to my work with the Asia Pacific Centre for the Responsibility to Protect. And the question, as soon as I started writing this book and telling people, well, I'm writing a book about world peace and how we can achieve it, the quote at the top of the slide there gives you a sense of the sort of reaction that I would get, the sort of rolling eyes, smug grins, awkward shuffle, and then I end up standing in a corner of the room all by myself. Why would someone write a book about world peace? Am I crazy, deluded, naive? Maybe I'm a hippie. Maybe I'm just seriously misled. Because, as Susan Sontag argued, not even pacifists tend to believe in world peace these days. It's a concept very much out of fashion. So how did I get to it? Well, a few years ago, on the day of the Brussels bombings, you may remember the Brussels bombings. I was in Brussels, and for reasons entirely unconnected to the Brussels bombings, was admitted to hospital in Brussels that night and spent a week there in hospital, and then was lucky that my colleague at UQ, Roland Bleicher, happened to be home in Switzerland at the time, and Roland came to Brussels, picked me up, and I spent another week or two with him and his mum recuperating in Zurich before the flight back to Australia. And that forced period of recuperation was a kind of a moment where I was able to kind of reflect on what we've been doing with the Asia Pacific Center for R2P and the policy work we were doing in the field of atrocity prevention, where the limits of some of that work were. And it occurred to me that this sort of work, this policy focused work on preventing mass atrocities, genocide and other things, was always going to be just a partial band-aid, always in emergency mode, always in response mode, unless we did more to tackle the underlying causes and sources of the problem. And that's an issue that's been growing increasingly urgent, as in the past few years, where we've been experiencing downwards trends in both armed conflict and atrocity crimes. Those trends have been reversed and things have been moving in the wrong direction. There are more wars, more civil wars, more cases of atrocity crimes, as we gather if we just look around the world today. And also it struck me that, asking these fundamental questions is important if we want to make serious structural change to the way we do our international politics and the place of violence, war, and mass atrocities in our international politics. So it was kind of a forced period of recuperation in rather nice surroundings that sort of led me to start thinking about some of the bigger questions relating to the sort of day-to-day work that I'd been doing. And that set me along this path with this book, whose aim is principally, as it says there, to try and make world peace a serious topic of study, research, and debate again, to make it something that really figures in the way we think about world politics, that figures in our policy debates, that figures in our research. It's something that we take seriously as an objective. And that's the goal of the book, if you like, is to say world peace is something that is possible. Not saying that it's likely, not saying that it's imminent. I'm saying that it's possible, and it's something that ought to be something that is hotly debated, discussed, researched, and thought about. So the argument that I want to present to you tonight, and I'm going to try and rattle through it fairly quickly to allow maximum time for discussion, but I see amongst some of the participants are some of my past students who know that when I say I'm going to try and get through it quickly, means that they're in for a long, long night of me talking to them. I'll try to break the habit of a lifetime tonight. So the case I want to outline to you, and I'll put it in kind of bold and stark terms, is firstly, I want to argue that world peace is possible. As I say, I'm not saying that it's likely. I'm not saying that we're on the right path. I want to argue that it is possible. I also want to say that actually when we boil down the elements of what world peace might look like, or the elements of politics that contribute to world peace, we actually know a lot of what we need to do. That the state of research on different elements relating to world peace, elements of law, democracy, governance, we have a fairly solid evidence base about what tends to make states and societies more peaceful, both internally and in their relations with each other, and what tends to make them more violent. So we actually know a lot of what we need to do. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Adding on to that, we actually already have many of the rules and institutions we need. If we are driven by that research to thinking about, well, what sorts of rules and institutions are needed for world peace, what we find is that many of them already actually exist. To pick just one out of thin air, one of the things the researchers discovered is that there is a close relationship between a society's peacefulness and a society's level of gender equality, which means that the more gender equal we make our societies, the more peaceful they are likely to be. That goal sounds maybe ambitious, but when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we see actually gender equality is right there as one of them. It's not some sort of pie in the sky idea that academics can cook up but will never happen. It's an idea that the entire membership of the UN General Assembly has signed up to. Whether or not they'll achieve it is another thing, but I think it's interesting that governments have signed up to that. And I want to argue that if we look through all the various different ways in which world peace might be built and strengthened and developed, we actually find that we don't need to build new institutions. We don't need hosts of new rules. Actually, if we just use the institutions and rules we already have, we'll get quite a bit of the way there. And so with all that in mind, I want to argue, as I've already said, that this should mean that world peace becomes something that we're going to take seriously, we're going to research, we're going to debate, we're going to argue about, and I think that is a legitimate thing that we can strive for. And what I'll argue at the very end is that it's in the striving that world peace is built. That world peace isn't going to be something that is built from the top down, but rather from the bottom up, and that in the striving for peace, in local settings, in particular and contingent moments, that's where you build those small pockets of peace, and world peace comes about by the joining together of those small pockets of peace, not from some sort of top-down macro solution or framework. What I'll do at the end, though, is I'm going to copy the formula used by someone who wrote a much better and more popular book on world peace than I did, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who in his account of perpetual peace argued that there were certain articles, definitive and categorical articles, that need to be achieved to move the world towards what he called perpetual peace. And I'm going to do the same at the end and outline some steps that can be taken using the institutions we have to make the world more peaceful, some additional steps that would make that peace more sustainable and deeper in the long run. And then I've added a final thing, which I've called the imperative article, which gives a hint of how we might start to get there. Okay, so why do I think world peace is possible? Well, the first reason is that when we look through human history, we can find actually that peace is much more common than we think. Our history books are full of wars, empires, devastation, and collapse. But that's because people have tended to write about those things, and they've tended not to write about the years in which not very much happened. If we go and add up all those years where not very much happened, those years in between the great calamities, what we find is two things. We find, firstly, most societies are peaceful most of the time. So whereas in our heads, we sometimes tend to think that war is the norm and that peace is some sort of aberration that's got to be kind of fought for and striven for. Actually, throughout all of history, it's the other way around. For most people, most of the time, peace is the norm and war is the aberration. If you were living during the time of the Pax Romana and you were lucky enough to live in a Roman province nowhere near the borders, the likelihood is, and you weren't in the army, the likelihood is you would have experienced several generations without warfare. And we can find pockets of that throughout history. We can also find pockets of whole societies that either avoided war for very long periods or never got into the business of war. The Phoenicians certainly built ships for other people to wage wars. So, for example, they built ships that the Greeks and the Persians used, but the Phoenicians themselves never actually had their own army, despite living in one of the most difficult and dangerous parts of the world. Right now, today, Costa Rica doesn't have an army, and we can find examples of that throughout history. So if we look carefully, we actually find that peace is more common than we think it is. The second reason why I think world peace is possible is because war, like peace, are human creations. Neither is rooted in our nature. In our nature, we have capacities both for aggression and for cooperation. And we always have had those two capacities. Neither one needs to rule over the other. In fact, you might argue that war is more about cooperation than about aggression. War requires sacrifice. It requires deep cooperation. An army full of people driven only by aggression would not be a very good army. And again, what we find when we go back to the earliest history of humanity is scant, if any, evidence that the earliest humans fought wars. Certainly they were violent, but whether they fought wars, the evidence isn't clear and isn't very good. Where humanity starts fighting wars is when we start moving towards settled civilizations. And so it's the form of politics we create, not our nature, that creates war. The other thing we find when we look at the deep history of war is that as soon as war appears on the historical record, so too do efforts for peace. So it's not as if we have kind of war as a natural phenomena and then peace comes in much later, as Michael Howard suggested in his book, The Invention of Peace, is that both of those things actually happen simultaneously. They're both human creations. And if something's a human creation, that means it is within the capacity of humans to reshape and change it. And that's the third point. And this is where the possibility of world peace comes from, the fact that change is possible. And sometimes we see quite dramatic change. You know, think of how Japan, for example, its culture and society and its relationship to war changed significantly in the space of just a few decades. Sweden is another country. Its change was slightly longer than a few decades, but Sweden went from being an aggressive imperialist bent on war throughout much of Central Europe to being what it is today, a largely non-militarist society pursuing a quite different vision of world politics. So we can see possibilities of change. And of course, change doesn't always run in one direction, it runs in both directions, but it's the fact of change itself that's really significant. Now, one of the key arguments of the book is that sadly, peace activism itself has been flawed in many respects. And one of the reasons I think why the goal and ideals of world peace aren't taken more seriously is because some of the activists and theorists behind it have put forward arguments that are not terribly compelling. So often in the literature, you'll see arguments that, you know, war is pathological, that it's always irrational, that it's evil, or it's some sort of class-based conspiracy, neither of which are actually very well supported by the evidence, and all of which lead to sets of policies and responses that tend to be either ineffective or counterproductive. And a good example of this is Henry Ford's Ship of Peace. So it's First World War is raging. You know, Henry Ford, the guy who's pioneered the mass production factory, decides to turn his immense skills to the search for peace in Europe. And so what he does is he comes up with the idea of hiring a ship. So he charters the ship that's in the picture there, and he thinks, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill that ship with all the leading peace activists of the time, sail it from America to Europe, and then they're going to get to Europe and they're going to negotiate a peace and then enter the First World War. Well, unfortunately, things didn't quite work out that way for the peace ship. As you can imagine, a ship full of peace activists soon kind of breaks down into fragmentation as the different peace activists argue with each other about the right approach and break up into factions. Then diseases break out. And by the time the ship finally reaches Ireland, half of the people have to be taken off because they're sick. The other half can't continue because they disagree fundamentally with each other, and the whole thing collapses in chaos. The other thing, of course, that was happening around this time just before was that the very outbreak of the First World War had given a kind of a shock to that idea that Europe was on the kind of road to progress driven by law and reason. The First World War was a kind of a shock to the system, that Europe could go so quickly from pursuing peace, cooperation, trade, to the devastation of 1914. And I think 1914 showed us that some of the ideas about the sources of war were misplaced. And one of the reasons why the global peace movement got 1914 so wrong, they weren't alone, socialists and Marxists got it so wrong as well, expecting that class solidarity would override nationalism. But I think the reasons why they got it so wrong is because they misunderstood what was actually driving war. They tended to write war off as an irrational pathology and not see the drivers of war for what they actually were. And if we take a step back and look at those drivers of war, I think there are three things that explain its persistence through human history since we had settled communities. The first is the very fact of human difference, that from that point of first settlement, humans have divided into different communities and groups that have different interests and values. And the fact that they have different interests and values mean that they come to clash. And in that clash, over the course of history, war has quite often proven itself to be a useful or profitable way of resolving differences. Riches were brought by war, wars for booty, wars for conquest, wars for empire. War also proved to be the ultimate way of resolving conflicts of interest, resolving conflicts over territory, over resources, over people. So war persists because groups do want different things, and war remains the way of determining who gets to determine the terms of the peace. That's the whole point. And the third thing is that war is contagious. And this, I think, is why my approach to world peace, and I think any approach to world peace, can't rely on pacifism. Because pacifism is all well and good so long as everybody is pacifist. But the truth is, but war spreads, and in a world with some pacifist states, the states that aren't pacifists get to dictate the terms to everyone. If we see what happened to a lot of those states and civilizations that did reject war, sooner or later, war comes knocking. So the Phoenicians may have managed to survive for hundreds of years without their own army, but when Alexander the Great arrived at the gates, they could only hold out for so long. And this is still a feature of contemporary civil war, for example, and contemporary interstate war. We know that one of the things that makes war in one country more likely is if its neighbor has a war as well. So war is contagious. In other words, you may not be interested in war, but sooner or later war will be interested in you. And I think these three things together explain why war still persists. Now, just a quick side note on the role of religion in all of this. Whenever you talk about, say that you're thinking about the kind of the underlying structural causes of war, someone always makes the Richard Dawkins point that, well, surely one of the key sources of war is religion. Religion being a main source of war, because if we disagree on fundamental matters of theology, well, we can't do anything about that other than fight a war. But actually, I think the role of religion is much more ambivalent. Religion can work both ways. And I think that for these three reasons here. Firstly, secular states are proven just as violent as non-secular. Let's not forget that, Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union were both formerly secular states. There's no evidence that switching from theocratic to secular state necessarily makes that state more peaceful, all other things being equal. Secondly, of course, all religious texts produced multiple positions on war. The texts themselves, be it the Quran or be it the Bible, are ambivalent, and they can be made by human institutions and individuals to serve either the cause of war or the cause of peace. In any major religion, you will find a wide variety of views on peace, ranging from the aggressive crusaders through to the pacifists. So it's not the texts themselves that is doing the causal work. And the third reason is this idea that we can separate out the sacred and the secular is so recent and is still only evident in some parts of the world, but it's difficult to be able to assign causal weight to it. So, for the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, for example, there was no distinction between the sacred and the secular. The public was also always the sacred. So that's, I think, are the underlying drivers of war. What do I think are the underlying drivers of peace? And what I want to suggest is there are three major building blocks that aren't always consistent, aren't always necessarily working with each other, but are the key building blocks of peace. The first is, I think, the modern state. The second are the economics of war and peace, the balance sheets of war and peace. And the third are to do with the emotional attachments and emotional responses to war and peace. And I think these three things can either push towards war or push towards peace. And these are the three kind of avenues, if you like, that we can work on when we're thinking about world peace. And I'll just unpack what I mean a little bit more now. So why do I think the state is so crucial? Firstly, I would say when we're talking about the state, of course, it's important to recognize that state building itself was almost always a very violent pastime. It involved some centuries of bloody and violent struggle over who would get to determine what the state was, who was going to rule the state, what its boundaries would be, and who would be citizens. But once states have been established, there's very clear trends that the rise of the modern state is associated with declines of violence, both in terms of levels of war, particularly, of course, civil war, but also levels of homicide, criminal violence, and other forms of violent death. It's a trend, like all long-term trends that have peaks and troughs, but seen over a very long time, those trends are clear. Also, of course, bear in mind that the further we go back, the worse the data is as well. At the same time, as the state has been associated with a decline of violence, it's also been associated with a rise in other sorts of goods. So a rise in social goods, economic welfare, technological goods, and the rest of it, which we can see with one straightforward measure, which is life expectancy. And life expectancy has risen almost uniformly with the rise of the modern state. Now, of course, unpacking that a little bit, some types of states do this more than others, and there's a whole floor in the library at UQ of studies about, well, what types of states are more peaceable than others. And just to kind of summarize a very large literature very briefly, and to kind of iron out a lot of the caveats and just focus on the kind of the headline points, the state that is kind of most peace supporting tends to have 5 main attributes. One, they have a monopoly of legitimate violence. Secondly, they have a government of laws that are accountable to the people. Usually that would be in a form of democracy, but there are other forms of accountability that aren't necessarily democratic, or that are more or less democratic, that would achieve the same goals or close enough to the same goals. Thirdly, they protect the core human rights of both individuals and especially minority groups. Fourthly, they provide a basic source of economic livelihood, or a basic degree of economic justice. And fifth, as I mentioned at the beginning, those states that promote and protect greater levels of gender equality tend to be more peaceful than those that don't. And now there's a whole body of literature looking at, well, why that is, but that's probably for another day. So what about the balance sheet? We come to the second element, the costs of war and peace. And here the argument is, well, it stands to reason that if one of the reasons why we fight wars is because it produces benefits, it allows us to get territory, it allows us to get rich, it allows us to grab booty, then the more those benefits erode, so our love of war will erode. So if war becomes less useful as a way of acquiring riches, booty, land, people, then war will become less attractive to us. And this has been one of the kind of core staples of arguments for world peace for the last kind of century or more. So some of the earliest arguments for world peace around the kind of the turn of the 20th century made exactly this argument. So Jean Bloch and Norman Angell famously made this argument that with industrialization, war was becoming so costly, so expensive that no one would be able to afford to fight it without facing their own internal revolutions, and therefore they'd move away from war. Of course, they got that fundamentally wrong with the First World War and then the Second World War, but maybe over the longer term, for shifting costs and benefits do point in that direction. For example, we've just had the catastrophe of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Here we've had a war that's gone on for 20 years in which the world's greatest superpower has taken on one of the world's poorest states and has failed to impose its will on that state, and has also had to pay quite a high cost in terms of both money and lives. The other attractive element of this part of the puzzle is that, of course, the costs and payoffs of war can be shaped. We can create systems, laws, processes to make war more expensive and less rewarding. And so some of the ways in which that balance can be shifted still further would involve things like further controls on the supply and cost of arms, further imposition of opportunity costs on war by opening up economic development, trade, and integration to those who move away from war, so as to change that balance sheet. Also measures to erode the political utility of war. So, there is a ban on wars of aggression in the UN Charter. If that was enforced, that would erode the political utility of war. So that's why it's important, for example, I think, that the world never recognizes Russia's annexation of the Crimea, because it's fundamental that we enforce the rule that you cannot simply invade and annex somebody else's territory, which means that you can never legitimize the forcible annexation of another's territory. Finally, and I think more difficult than either thinking about the state or thinking about the economics of war, are the emotions around war. And I think George Orwell captured this beautifully at the start of The Lion and the Unicorn. And I kind of use this quote all the time because I think it's just such a powerful quote, which comes from his time fighting in the Spanish Civil War. And he writes, "As I write, highly civilized human beings, i.e. the German Luftwaffe, are flying overhead trying to kill me. They do not feel any enmity against me as an individual, nor I against them. They are only doing their duty, as the saying goes. Most of them, I have no doubt, are kind-hearted, law-abiding men who would never dream of committing murder in private life. On the other hand, if one of them succeeds in blowing me to pieces with a well-placed bomb, he will never sleep any the worse for it. His country is his country, which has the power to absolve him from evil." And I think that neatly captures the way in which some of the kind of emotional and value-based ideas around war serve to kind of change our normal kind of rationality and morality. Because the underlying thing would be, as I've just sort of said with the experience from Afghanistan, if war really was just policy by another means, if it really was all just about rational calculation, I think we'd be close to abolishing it by now, because the natures of wars are such that it is so difficult now for one side to impose its will on another and extract booty and resource as a product of war. But war isn't just policy by other means. It's driven by powerful emotions, by identities, by a sense of belonging, and by a purpose. And it's important when we're thinking about emotions, not just to think that war is driven by kind of negative emotions like fear, aggression. Also positive emotions, love and empathy can promote war. A lot of people do terrible things because they think they have to do it in order to protect the things that they love. So most emotions in and of themselves can be put to the service of either peace or war. And one of the key arguments that I make in the book is that the passion for war, the kind of the faith in war, is driven by, I think, a distorted image and trivialization of war. I think this is reaching back a century, but our public discourse, our media portrayals of war have the effect of distorting our sense of what it is. Only those who've actually been in war have a meaningful sense of what war is like. The rest of us have this third-party Anzac Day war movies vision of war, which is really quite different from the reality. So how can we try to reorient these passions and emotions towards greater peace? Well, one idea is through fostering those initiatives that promote the idea of human equality, promote the idea of the enemy being humans just like that, on the basis that it is harder to do wrongs to people that we see as being quite like ourselves. Jane Addams, one of the kind of the heroes of the story, and one of the first peace activists out of Chicago, talked about building peace from the bottom up by bringing together people from across political divides to work on common projects with one another. Virginia Woolf and many others tried to challenge this trivialized and distorted image of war by arguing that actually we should present the actuality of what war does to people. So she talked about the importance of not shutting away the victims of the First World War, particularly those who came back with really awful head injuries, but showing people what war actually does to a person's skull, and that showing them what war actually does to a person's skull will change the way a lot of people think about war. Another way is by promoting and protecting the space for dissent. One of the things that happens when war breaks out is that space for dissent is shrunk. One of the very first things that happens. Whether or not we happen to agree with the dissenter's position, one of the key ways of pushing back against the passions of war is to always allow space for dissent. And that flows into the next bit, which is allowing the right for people to opt out of having to fight for war. So promoting the idea that everyone has a right to follow their own conscience on whether or not they would fight a war. And that would have two effects. One, allowing people to follow their own conscience would be a good in itself. But two, meaning that a state or a group could only prosecute a war if it really could persuade enough people of the legitimacy and justice of its case, that where there was serious doubt and a right to opt out, societies, governments might find it difficult to actually sustain the war. So what are my proposals for world peace then? So the first, again, mirroring Kant, are preliminary articles. So these are things that include rules we already have, institutions we already have, and that if we did all of these 6 things, I think it was, we would make the world more peaceful than it is today. We wouldn't get all the way to world peace, but it would be more peaceful. So the first one is basically, if states were to follow the laws we already have. So we have rules governing the use of force. We have a UN Security Council that is mandated to ensure international peace and security. So if we actually had a world where states followed the law and where the UN Security Council actually did its job to maintain international peace and security, that would be a good start. A follow-on from that is that each of those members of the UN should do their fair share to implement the decisions taken by the UN and other international institutions. That means contributing to peacekeeping operations, for example, or other international policing operations authorized by the UN. At the moment, the burden is rather uneven. And as a result, a lot of decisions that are taken by the Security Council never get implemented. One study a few years ago found that only about a quarter of the UN Security Council demands, those things that are supposed to be legally binding, actually ever get fulfilled. Thirdly, no state or private corporation should transfer arms to those who might be reasonably expected to use them in violation of international law. Well, we have now the Arms Trade Treaty that goes some of the way in achieving that, and Australia played a pivotal role in that, but there remain loopholes, and that treaty also, of course, has not been signed or implemented by everyone. If we take that and extend it, it will affect the transfer of armaments that will impact those decisions and states' abilities to wage war. Fourthly, within their own neighborhoods, states should establish regional organizations, or what some people call security communities. That is, kind of cooperative security arrangements to enhance security within their own neighborhood. And these communities can link together. Individuals should enjoy a universal right of hospitality. This is one I stole directly from Kant. That is the right and freedom to travel as soon as kind of COVID is under control, of course, and the free and fair movement of goods, services, people, and really crucially, ideas. It's vital that people and goods are able to move, that trade is able to develop, because that supports cooperation and mutual wealth building, but also that ideas are allowed to cross across borders as well, because that challenges the inflow of ideas from outside, challenges some of those passions and ideas that can lead towards war. And finally, that this is one of the more radical ones of these articles, that individuals should be held criminally accountable, not just for crimes like genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, but also for aggression. Sounds radical, but we do have the International Criminal Court that is there to do just that. and the International Criminal Court has just added the crime of aggression to its list of crimes. So again, we have the courts, we have some of the laws, we just need to expand uptake of the court, improve its ability to actually enforce its laws. So those are my preliminary articles. That will get us some of the way.
We've got our questions piling up, so maybe another minute or so.
Perfect, thanks, David. I'll run through these ones really quickly. So the definitive articles, these are the big things for the kind of long-term change. One is about the nature of the state, making sure that each state is capable, responsible, and legitimate sovereign. The second is the importance of gender equality that I've already mentioned. Working towards gender equality in and of itself will make the world more peaceful. And thirdly, the universal right of conscientious objection that I talked to earlier, that all individuals should have the right to opt out of war. And then the final article is what I call the Lorax article, the imperative of basically that none of this will happen by itself. How it will happen is from the bottom up by individuals, organizations, governments, organizing to support world peace, support particular initiatives, build world peace in the here and now, and local peace. And it's in the joining together of local initiatives focused on some of those things that I've just talked about, but we start to make little bits of a difference. So thank you very much. And thanks for putting up with me, and apologies for talking for too long.
No, that was terrific. Once again, Alex, that talk was both entertaining and informative. We do have some questions. I might just start with one of my own. I mean, with 24-hour news channels, you could be forgiven for thinking that the whole world was in flames, whereas it's located in probably half a dozen countries around the world. Is the current trend at the moment towards conflict or towards peace? I mean, some commentators are saying after what's happened in Afghanistan, Islamists will be emboldened. You've got the decline of the US at the same time as the rise of China, Russia, and other authoritarian states. Which way is the curve going? Is it going up or is it going down?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, it changes every year just to make it more difficult. In broad strokes, from 1995 till the Arab Spring of 2011, it was going consistently downwards to the point where by 2010, 2011, it was lower than it had been at any point since the Second World War. Since after 2011, it went up fairly sharply for a few years. And that was primarily because of the conflicts in the Middle East triggered by the Arab Spring. So Syria, Libya, Yemen. Over the last 3 or 4 years, it's plateaued and started to decline a little bit. To put it in kind of broader terms, so where we are now is about globally in terms of number of conflicts and how deadly they are, is about where we were in 2005, which is still lower than we were in 1995, much lower than where we were in 1985, and way lower than in 75 and 65. One of the problems, you're right, the 24-hour news cycle creates this kind of image of a world on fire everywhere. Also, we have a really Pollyanna-ish view of what the past was like.
Yeah,
you know, it was pretty awful back in the Cold War and before. And so when we're measuring the present day, it's important to keep in mind just how bad things used to be.
Okay. We'll go on some of the questions that have come in. Alex, many of our international institutions are based on relations between states and non-interference in domestic matters. Are you making a distinction between states and within states, or both?
Yeah, so I think the principle of non-interference is a cornerstone of stable and orderly relations between states. I think that the UN Charter does a really good job of balancing that with the occasional need for collective action. So the UN Charter says, look, sometimes through the Security Council, the UN can violate the principle of non-interference, that nothing stands in the way of the UN Security Council enforcing its own decisions when it chooses to do so. And so I think the Council, the UN Charter balances that really well. We've got a general principle, but we've got the point that the Security Council, when it can reach a decision, can do whatever it sees necessary. And that's where we get to the problem of the veto power. And of course, the veto power is sometimes a a bit of a pain in the neck, to put it colloquially, but it also plays a really important function in that it's a check, a block on certain states just using the UN to pursue their own particular interests, because it means that, if the US wants to do something with the UN, it has to persuade China and Russia to go along with it as well, which is a difficult business. So I think the balance with the way the UN Charter works is right, in the way that it balances non-interference with the occasional need for collective action. I think what I would like to see is the Council going back to being a bit more cooperative and putting the interests of international peace and security before the national interests of the permanent members.
That's great. We've got one here from Susan de Groot-Hoortner. Do you foresee a shift from interstate to intrastate war with the prevalence of growing binary social divisions related to topics such as climate change, COVID-19 and immigration?
Yeah, good question. So that shift happened in the 70s and 80s. So we've seen over the long term a shift from interstate to civil wars. What we're seeing now is an increase in what we might call transnational wars. So we're seeing more wars where third-party states are getting involved. So a lot of civil wars. So for example, civil war in Tigray right now has Ethiopia, the Tigrayans, but also the Eritreans involved. Civil war in Syria had Syrian parties as well as Iran, US, Russia, Turkey, Jordan, Israel, Hezbollah involved. And that I think is the trend now, is we're moving away from pure civil wars and towards more what we might call transnational wars, where you have both a civil war component, but also more international. And what you're seeing in some of these wars as well is a greater subcontracting out. So we're seeing, the Russians and the West using mercenaries, for example. The West with, was it Blackstone, the Russians with the Wagner group. And I think we're going to see that more and more and more as well. With the recent Azerbaijan-Armenia thing, we saw, Turkey and Russia involved in that and working with proxies there.
That's good. You did mention before about war being profitable. And there's one here from Abbas Raza Alvi. Now, the world is investing 3 trillion each year in arms trade, guns, bullets, etc. And this has to be used somewhere to manage the economics of manufacturing this. So we're talking here about the military-industrial complex. So long as we're producing all this equipment, how can we establish peace?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think I would push back on the idea that it has to be used. I don't think it has to be used.
Yeah.
The US will keep buying the new generation of weapons, irrespective of whether it's used the old generation of weapons or not. So I think that complex can keep going irrespective. And of course, what the US has done is diversify into high tech, so it can spend more money on fewer things, if you like. So it has fewer soldiers, but it can spend more money on them because it's diversifying into high tech. But if you look at the cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the effects of that on the American economy, you can see that there's a link between that and the current budget crunch that the US government has, and the GFC, for example. And then when you think, well, that's the world's greatest superpower, and it can't sustain a war in 2 fairly insignificant militarily places like Afghanistan and Iraq without risking its own economy. It'd be like the equivalent of the Roman Empire bankrupting itself, fighting a small rebellion in Portugal. That tells you something about the changing nature of war. I don't know of any country that's come out of a war in the last 2 decades, or any party that's come out of a war in the last 2 decades, wealthier than it went into the war.
Right. Thank you. Look, how do peace studies, this is from A.H. Basaran, how do peace studies and these articles handle and factor in the long-term plight of millions of people being displaced due to current wars? A lot of refugees.
In 2 ways, my little suggestions do, but of course, the real world has much more complex. One is this right of hospitality. So I think part of that would be a right of asylum. That one of the ways in which states can protect victims of war without, for example, intervention, is by offering asylum, by encouraging people to flee and seek asylum in other countries and being kind of fairly generous on that front. The other is, in that one of the things that I skip past, the sort of state that is the more peaceful sort of state are those that protect basic human rights. Now, one of the things we've learned is there's no shortcut to building a world of states that do that. You can't just kind of intervene and say, you know, this is how you're going to do it. Now you've all got to be human rights loving, protecting, and all the rest of it. That's all. Building human rights is a long-term, multi-generational exercise, and it's got to involve local partnerships and long-term sustained investment and engagement. And again, the overall, you know, although there's been deficits and retreats from democracy in the past few years, again, if you look at a kind of a multi-decade picture, you still see that there is progress. And of course, you're going to get setbacks from time to time. But the fact that our expectations are changing is why I think one of the reasons why we get so disappointed at those setbacks. We get so disappointed because we expect states and societies to be able to do better. And we didn't always expect that. Go back to Cambodia in the 70s, no one was expecting foreign help or intervention or support to help Cambodians against the Khmer Rouge.
Okay, we've got a question here from an anonymous attendee. And it says, if the UN relies on member states to sign up to treaties and apply them in national law, how can the preliminary articles which you presented here entice member states? How can peace, in other words, become sexy?
Yeah, great question. And that's where the second set of the definitive ones reinforce the first, because what's got to happen is that societies have got to change, and societies have got to put pressure on their governments to do these things. So, you know, we've got to say things like, you know, the Australian government has signed up to the Arms Trade Treaty. Are we implementing it properly? Are we really doing due diligence? You know, for example, if we sell arms to Saudi Arabia, are we absolutely sure that Saudi Arabia aren't going to use them to commit acts of aggression or crimes against humanity in Yemen, for example? And if we're not sure of that, can we use our own legal system? Can we challenge in the High Court? Can we lobby MPs? So that's ultimately the change will only be sustainable in the long run, and governments will only see it in their interests if their societies and populations kind of force it upon them and make them see it in their own interests. And tactically, I would say, you know, each country is going to be different and the politics are different in each country. But, you know, there are 2 or 3 areas where, you know, in any government, so for ours, you know, the fact that we're invested in the Arms Trade Treaty makes that something that we can press them on. But only when electorates push their governments will governments kind of move from just symbolic signing up to things to actually delivering.
Okay. There's a recent Four Corners on the fact that technology is going to alter war, especially, you know, with your first world countries. With already got the drones, which Obama used extensively, and the prospect of robots and other artificial intelligence coming in wars. How does this factor into what you're talking about?
Yeah, good question. Short answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
My worry is that by reducing the costs of contributing to war, it shifts that balance back to war. Because if you can just send a bunch of drones or a bunch of AI and maybe some local proxies off to fight for you, then the costs to you of doing that fighting go down so much that you're incentivized to wage war. On the other side, the sort of the Clausewitzian in me says, well, technology always changes, and the technologies of war don't change the fundamental essence of war. So we might be able to send drones or send armed robots, but that doesn't mean we can't control the territory. We can't control the population. We can't extract resources, let's say, unless we control the land, and that will still require people. And actually, we'll probably be more reluctant to send people into places that we're only controlling robotically through drones. So I think one of the things that I have learned over kind of a few years doing this is be cautious about predicting the future, because stuff happens that you don't expect. And I think this is the big question, the big frontier going forward. What it's going to look like, I'm not sure.
Yeah, probably time for one more question. This is from Peter Londy. He writes, a lot of your suggestions tend to reflect the UN Charter with its focus on conflict between states. Much of the violence is within states, between ethnic groups, rich corporations and local people, etc. In addition, climate change will exacerbate inequalities and provoke refugee flows. I'll just ask you two questions here. Climate change, where does that factor in? And also, can can you retain your optimism in the face of all these factors, especially when a state such as Australia has more or less totally withdrawn from peacekeeping?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, thanks, Peter. So the optimism is more because I think we've got a lot of the building blocks, not because I think we're necessarily going to use those building blocks in the right way. As I mentioned, I've been working on Syria the last couple of years. That the essence of that book is the complete opposite of this one, which is that it's all a mess and it's horrible. And that in a way makes me more depressed because we have so many of those building blocks in place and the opportunities there. So I worry about the direction we're going in, and absolutely have little optimism about that. On climate change, for me, the jury is kind of out. We know that climate change will exacerbate existing sources of threat. I think it's over exaggerating things to say that climate change itself will cause more wars. I don't think there's any evidence for that.
You don't think it was a factor in the Syrian war?
No.
No.
I think it's
a lot of people are saying that.
I know. I think it's a fundamental mistake. I think the Assad regime, the mental thing that I say is, imagine the same drought in Texas. Does that produce a war? Well, no. So it's not the drought that's causing it. It was all the kind of politics around. Now, climate change is an accelerator and will create displacement, but it doesn't necessarily mean that accelerator has to lead to. I don't think there's a kind of inevitable causal chain.
Well, that comes to the end of our event tonight, and thank you very much, Alex. Once again, you've shown why you're one of our go-to people for events at AIIA Queensland. We do have to tell you about some events coming up. September 14, we have distinguished former diplomat Ian Kemish, and he'll be speaking about his book, The Consul, which will be published by UQP in May 2002. Ian led the Australian Consular Service from 2000 to 2004. That's the time of the Bali bombings. And also served as Australian Ambassador to Germany and Switzerland and Australian High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea. That's coming up on September 7th, and we're hoping to have that in person at Holding Redlich and also online. September the 14th, we're looking to have the Japanese ambassador to Australia, Mr. Shingo Yamagami, and he will be talking about the importance of future cooperation between Japan and Australia in the Indo-Pacific. Hopefully we're having him in Brisbane as well. He's planning to come up here, COVID allowing. We're just about to the end of our presentation for tonight. So once again, thanks to everyone for taking part, and thank you and good night.